Okie dokie, guys, last two chapters. So, chapter 18 is kind of a downer. Chapter 18, we're going to talk a lot about how we are needing to conserve biodiversity, what is being done about that, and why. Right? So, there's a lot of details here. We talked a little bit about the sixth mass extinction way back in the fall. Right? We talked a little bit about it. We talked about how there's evidence for it. Now we're going to hit it a little bit harder. Basically, we are experiencing as a planet, not just as humanity, but as a planet in a global ecosystem, we are seeing a massive decline in genetic diversity. Their scientists estimate that each year we are losing about 50,000 species to extinction. That is a remarkable number. And then the UN Convention of Biological Diversity, they estimate that rate of extinction is 1,000 times higher now than it was 50 years ago. So if it is that much higher because of during the time that humans are here, then that is an indication that humans are playing a part in it. Now, as this last bullet point shows, some declines absolutely have natural causes, but then some are not. Now, why does this matter? Because genetic diversity is extremely important. That genetic diversity is what keeps ecosystems ticking. That's what kind of keeps them in a series of, in a system of maintenance where that everything is a healthy, we have, a normal influx and decrease in numbers. But if we don't have that high genetic diversity, then what's going to happen is we get inbreeding. We get issues with offspring having reproductive issues, the inability to reproduce. So that low genetic diversity can cause major issues further in the future. So that high genetic diversity really does help improve the feasibility, the statistics that those species would be able to survive future change in the environment. And that is absolutely necessary to maintain a global ecosystem as well as each individual smaller ecosystem. Now, this isn't just happening in the wild, but also domesticated species that we as humans have domesticated for livestock, pets, all that kind of stuff. That is also seeing a huge decline in genetic variation. Why? Because we have selectively bred specific traits to be favorable. Now, that has served us well thus far. However, what if some of those traits that we have bred out would have increased the survival rate or the genetic success of that species? Right now, it looks like half the breeds of livestock that were present in 1900 are completely extinct. And it says 43% of those remaining are at serious risk of extinction because we have selectively bred for specific traits. And in North America, 80% of those are declining or already facing extinction. So you talk about heirloom varieties or heirloom breeds, those kinds of things. Those are what they're looking at trying to, in a way, revive and try to keep some of those traits going. So around the world, we have seen this as a problem. And one of the big problems here is with seeds and plants. So when you see something called an heirloom tomato, that's because it's a variety that was kind of lost and someone was able to, through seed keeping and kind of resurge that interest in that variety. And it might have a virus. It might have an ability to fight off certain viruses or illnesses or things like that to help possibly make them more viable for the future. And yes, we do have actual storage for these seeds to help keep seed diversity up. Now, let's kind of talk about species as a whole. So, species around the world, we have different rankings for them. We have what we call threatened species, and these have a high risk of extinction. This is all based on the Union for Conservation of Nature. There are what we also call near threatened species. They're ones that are declining in number, but are not yet at high risk for extinction. And then we have those that we say that are of least concern. So there's lots of them, very abundant numbers of those species. This graph here shows you kind of how, if you're looking at the different types of organisms, conifers meaning evergreen trees, birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, and fish. This is located on page 657 of your book. It shows you how what percentages of these are considered to be threatened, near threatened, and those of least concern. Conifers they're tossed in there because there's almost 50% of them, over 50% of them are considered either threatened or near threatened. Because again, we have selectively bred for certain species because they may not drop as many needles, or they're prettier in our front yard. They're better, they make better Christmas trees, those kinds of things. Now take a look at the amphibians. Amphibians, they historically have always had higher rates of threatened and near threatened. One of the reasons why amphibians are so easily affected by this and by being threatened and declining species diversity is because their skin is very thin. They breathe through their skin as well as through their nose, right? So, like, their skin allows moisture in, it is very permeable to water. So, therefore, also chemicals and things that are dissolved in the water, acid rain, those kinds of effects. So, amphibians are at a higher risk of being detrimentally, impacted by pollution. And so, therefore, they tend to be more threatened or near threatened. Now, we've also talked about how ecosystem values affect the planet, how they affect how we function within ecosystems. We've talked about intrinsic values. We've talked about instrumental values. Intrinsic means that it's something that only we as humans would appreciate and would benefit from. So these are the things like cultural values. So like you go to a national park because because culturally it is significant to us as people. It could be based on religion, things like that. Instrumental value are ones that they are values that we can show and indicate that we need to make sure that we adhere, and they have a worth that can be quantitative, not as well as qualitative. So we need to keep those numbers up. We can calculate them. And this is all back to those ecosystem services that we talked about in the fall. And here they are again, if you forgot: provisions, regulating services, support systems. Then we also need to talk about resilience and, again, those cultural services. So provisions, remember, we talked about this, that is what can humans use directly: lumber, wood for paper, plants for agriculture, things like that. So what can we tap into, like rubber from rubber trees, maple syrup from maple trees, those kinds of things. A lot of prescription pills come from, and non-prescription pills, homeopathic as well, come from natural sources. And so those would be considered provisions as well. Regulating services has to do with keeping that ecosystem ticking and going. So this would be the role of photosynthesis in the trees to help remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It would be the role of fixing nitrogen in the soil so that way plants can use that nitrogen. This kind of comes back to all of those biochemical cycles. How do we maintain the water cycle? All of those. So that is whenever we're talking about those regulating services. Support services are the ones that help. To me, the way I think of it is support services help support regulating services in a way. So this would be things like how the bees and how pollinators help pollinate the crops to help keep those crops going, help keep those flowers blooming, seeding, and then germinating, etc. That would also be things for how do earthworms kind of help accommodate plant growth? How do ladybugs eat the aphids? And, those kinds of relationships. Resilience depends on that genetic diversity. So if you only have a few species that are serving roles in an ecosystem, each role, each species has a huge number of roles that they're playing, and they're less likely to be resilient to change because guess what? They have so many roles that they are having to fill. They're more likely to be impacted negatively by something, an illness, a natural disaster, something. But if you have several different species that are sharing roles, then that tends to kind of help boost their resilience. So if a pollutant can negatively impact, say, a type of algae, there may be another species of algae that is resilient against that pollution, and therefore it can kind of help fill that niche. This kind of helps kind of fill a lot of niches across the ecosystems, and this is extremely important. And then we're back to those cultural services that truly only pertain to us as humans. So this kind of comes to the whole like, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful, I want to go see it, or I want to experience that. The article that you may have seen about like the 10 most beautiful waterfalls you need to see around the world. Those are kind of cultural services, tourism, religious expeditions, being able to come into contact with nature as a human, those kinds of things. So those are cultural services. And the decline of ecosystem services is really, really important because they have identified what they consider to be 24 ecosystem functions. The majority of those, over half of them, have been found to be declining or not sustainable. So what we need to do is we need to work on increasing these ecosystem services to find a better balance between humanity living on our planet as well as all the other organisms. All right, I'm going to pause there.